Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our examination experience panel, moderated by Carlo DeFlorio, Partner and Global Chief Services Officer of ACA Group.
Great, thank you everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started so that we don't slow down the rest of the day. Hopefully everybody had a great lunch and a good afternoon session. I'm Carlo DeFlorio, Chief Services Officer at ACA Group. And prior to joining ACA, I spent about a decade in regulation, first as the director of the OC office at the SEC, now the Division of Exams, and then as the Chief Risk and Strategy Officer at FINRA, and before that I was a partner at PwC. We have a wonderful panel here today, and I'd like to ask Tracy and John and Anil to introduce themselves and provide you with a little context for where their experiences that they'll share will come from. So Tracy, we'll start with you.
Sure. I'm Tracy Zerley. I'm Managing Director and Senior Counsel at Affiliated Managers Group in Boston. I'm responsible for legal and regulatory compliance matters across AMG's corporate team, as well as our distribution entities, including mutual funds and non-U.S. distribution offices. I've been with AMG for 14 years, and prior to that, I spent time in global compliance roles at State Street Global Advisors and Wellington Management Company, and I started in the financial services group at Deckard. John?
Great.
Thanks, Tracy. John Hadfield. I'm a CCO of Vanguard Global Advisors and the head of our fund and advisor compliance team. That's mainly the U.S. funds and ETFs. I've been at Vanguard for about 3 years now and joined on the legal side and joined about 2 years ago on the compliance side. So it's been a nice run. Before that, I was with USAA in a very similar capacity, and before that was in law firm land in Washington, D.C. here with Evershed Sutherland and Allen & Overy.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. My name is Anil Abraham. I started my career here in Washington many years ago, and it's great to be back. I spent a good chunk of my time in Washington at the SEC in a variety of roles, including the Investment Management Division and the Division of Enforcement. I also worked on the executive staff for many years, serving as a counsel to 2 chairmen and 2 commissioners of the SEC, and in that role I did see a good deal of rulemaking, examination work, and quite a lot of enforcement cases. I left DC a few years ago to move up to New York and move in-house. Met a company called Focus Financial Partners. We are a holding company that owns approximately 75 RIAs, so we get our fair share of exams and hope to bring that experience to bear today.
Great. Thank you all. So Anil, John, Tracy, and I thought that we would hone in on 4 particular issues and talk about those over the next 45 minutes. One is, what were the exam trends that we saw during COVID and continue to see now? Second is, what are the common deficiencies that we're seeing from SEC exams? The third is recent SEC exam focus areas that we're seeing emerge. And then fourth is what to expect when it's your turn for an SEC exam. We thought that the format we would take is, with each of these topics, I'll share some ACA industry-wide perspective and then turn it over to Anil, John, and Tracy to share the experiences they're having from their firm perspective and the observations from that perspective. We are not going to flip through slides, but we did create a 20-slide deck for you as a reference material that will really touch on a lot of what we're going to talk on. So hopefully that's a helpful reference material for you. So let's dive in. The first topic is COVID environment exam trends. From an ACA perspective and industry-wide, we've certainly observed continued remote exams by the SEC, and we expect those to continue. Many of you have probably had the experience where an examiner is either on the video or not on the video, but that is certainly something that has worked well for them, and they're going to continue here as we go forward. A second observation is that we have seen a significant expansion in scope of SEC exams of private fund managers, and so it's no surprise as you see all of these new private fund rule proposals coming out They're informed by a few years of significant exams. The third is that we've seen the SEC scrutiny extending to periods prior to registration. So they're going deeper, broader, and earlier in exams. Fifth, we see the new Event and Emerging Risk Exam team, EART, doing some really interesting work. It's a multidisciplinary team with great skill sets. They're looking at key risks like cybersecurity, cyber attacks. They're also looking at key market events, so the meme stock volatility, and certainly that team is probably significantly deployed right now, looking at Ukraine conflict impacts. And then finally, we've seen an increased focus on valuations of illiquid assets. So let me turn it over, maybe starting with Tracy, to hear from the panel perspectives on this from your individual firm.
Thank you. I probably should have mentioned in my previous remarks that, like Anil, we have a group of affiliated investment managers, about 40, and over the past 2 years, we've probably been through 8 to 10 exams. So we have seen a lot of exam activity and the approaches that different regions are taking. The one thing I would say is that they are very focused on policies and procedures. They expect your compliance program to be dynamic, and COVID is no exception. So it does feel a little bit like ticking and tying, but they're looking at your procedures, running black lines, and making sure that they actually reflect the way your procedures should have evolved based on the fact that you likely have a number of people working from home. They've also been very focused on the protection of confidential information. How are you dealing with document destruction when people are working from home? And consistent with their market integrity objectives, they're asking a lot of questions about material non-public information, what you're doing to make sure that with people, particularly families with multiple people working, how you're protecting information and making sure that you've got controls in place around MNPI. The second thing I would note is that, consistent, Carlo, with your comment, the regions are becoming increasingly more collaborative, and it's not uncommon for them to pick up the phone and call with a question. We've seen them ask questions about our experiences with liquidity events, particularly around the Ukraine-Russia crisis, the fixed income markets. And so they really do look at your Form ADV, your Form PF, they're crunching that data, and they're reaching out with questions in a fairly collaborative way.
Great, thanks, Tracy. John, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to bring a perspective, as I'd mentioned earlier, from the maybe the institutional side, but I also have peers who are attending this conference today who are on the retail side. So I'm going to borrow some of their knowledge and some of their input as well from the CCOs on the retail side. I think for us, we've seen a lot of calls from the staff that are informal. They're not expecting an exam. As Tracy alluded to, it's oftentimes during times of market turmoil or a particular issue that they're eager to dig into. They're respectful. They've given us plenty of time and have not pressured us to jump on, which is nice. A general observation as well is that while the SEC may have been remote and oftentimes in our experience has been off camera, other regulators like the NFA like to be on camera. So there's no, and some other regulators as well. I think on the banking side is where I recall that there may have been some videos. So those are some general observations of our recent experience during COVID. I think on the retail side, I've been informed by colleagues like my colleague Claire Burke and Rich Sarhadi that they're interested in looking at dual registrants and digging into supervision and understanding how fiduciary duty and suitability match up. This has sort of been a thing in the industry, and it continues during COVID. So maybe, Tracy, maybe that matches some of yours as well.
Great. Thanks, John. Anil, what are you seeing?
Well, when the pandemic started in early 2020, I think we probably had around 60 firms, and we're now at 75. My working assumption is that 15 to 20% of those firms are going to be in an exam at any point in time. And certainly at the tail end of 2019, we had our fair share of exams that were ongoing. One of the things that surprised me really about the experience is that those exams continued relatively seamlessly with the transition to a full remote environment. I think the staff did a great job, really, of transitioning to that. And I think they used to do about 30% of the exams remotely, so they had practice, and when it came time to really execute, they did a great job. We only had, I think, 2 new investment advisor exams initiated in 2020. I think we had 4 other types of exams that were initiated, but last year we had 14 IA exams initiated. So as far as I can tell, the exam program has not skipped a beat. It's thorough. They did express some curiosity, as you might expect, about business continuity. How are things going working from home? How are you handling your IT setups? Are your IT backups working for people that are working from home? All of which are, I think, fair game for the staff to ask and for firm staff to grapple with. I guess the last thing that I'd note about the staff is really from the beginning, they were uniformly courteous about granting accommodations for firms that were significantly affected by COVID. I'm sure you all remember how chaotic it was the first few months of the pandemic, and especially then, but even to this day, if you need an accommodation because your firm is hit by COVID, the staff has been willing to grant it. Now, we've urged our firms not to take advantage of that unless they really need it, but it's really nice knowing that it's there if you do need it, and I think it's a great example of good government.
Great. Thanks, Anil.
Hey, Anil, just one comment. We had a member chat us up right before we came on, and while I think our experience has been generally that the staff has been reasonable in their timing and understanding rolling productions, this member indicated that they experienced a situation that just before the holidays, they were hit with a 90-question...
150.
Oh, excuse me, 150 question exam that was right before the holidays, and there was no leniency on that. So I want to just make sure that we're being balanced here and understanding our experience and our members' experience. So yeah. I'm not sure if that was an anomaly or not, but there are those types of experiences out there.
That's true. We have seen a number of initial request lists that are over 100 items long and extremely thorough. I've never seen one that's 150.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, why don't we turn to our second item, which is common deficiencies that we are observing. From an ACA industry-wide perspective, we've observed 3 common deficiency categories. The first is private funds, no surprise based on my prior comments. And the common deficiencies that we're seeing here are the ones that really came out in the 2 private fund risk alerts from the summer of 2020 and then the recent one here in January. A real focus on deficiencies around conflicts of interest, material non-public information, fees and expenses, liquidity, side letters, valuation, and performance marketing. Many of these deficiencies have now found their way into, obviously, the risk alert and into the rule proposal, so we'll be spending a lot more time as we work around comments all together and see what comes with the final rule proposal going forward. The second broad category is around ESG. And this is even before the ESG rulemaking proposals that we're expecting very soon, just based on existing authority. We're seeing a lot of common deficiencies around marketing of ESG, controls and disclosures around ESG, portfolio management, proxy voting, and adherence to standards like the principles for responsible investing. What do you say you're doing? And can you demonstrate that you're doing what you say you're doing kind of across the board there? Similar to the private funds, 2 risk alerts that the exams division issued, which were very helpful resources. I'm sure you all are using those. There was a very good ESG risk alert that came out sharing kind of detailed perspective on these deficiencies and how they're looking at them. And then the third broad category was around the custody rule. And here we've seen common deficiencies around the annual audit, around the surprise audit, around whether the firm is using a PCAOB certified auditor, whether there was a final audit upon liquidation, and around whether the custodian was sending out quarterly account statements and sort of ownership at the firm level for following up on that. So let me turn it over, and maybe John, we'll start with you this time. What are some of the common deficiencies that you're experiencing and observing?
Yeah, I think in general, on both the retail and institutional side, it's really deficiencies are focused on the risk alerts. So if I can give a call to anything, it's go back and read those risk alerts. I think it's fair to say that they're giving a great roadmap to what we should expect. I haven't seen, in my experience, I haven't heard my peers say there's been any gotcha moments with any of these, but they are looking at, they want us to document what we say we're doing. And so if it's not documented, it doesn't happen. And so that's certainly been, seen that in a few instances. On the retail side, they're looking at mapping to brochure disclosures, not surprisingly. And Best X review is another one that's receiving scrutiny, sort of the process behind it, process and documentation behind that. And supervision in a remote environment is a big one, right? Just understanding the differences between pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Excellent.
So, yep.
Anil, what are you seeing?
Well, most of our firms are traditional wealth management firms. They're not advisors to massive hedge funds or massive private funds. And so we see, fairly commonly, and this is true going back many years, a lot of the greatest hits of deficiencies. So you have advertising and marketing complaints about the use of superlatives, or about the presentation of performance numbers, which is really an art, not a science. Oversights regarding the custody rule, for example, having money transfer authority for a client without subjecting that client's accounts to a custody audit, having user ID, logins and passwords, that sort of thing. One of the things that we see from time to time is they press pretty hard on fee billing. And they want you to be able to prove for a sample of clients that they've chosen that you've correctly billed the fees, and they really want you to, recalculate those down to the last dollar and substantiate it, which I think is actually fair. I mean, you should be able to get the billing right. But sometimes there are inadvertent errors in calculation. You may leave one account out of the household, and as a result, maybe that account doesn't get the full benefit of fee tiering. And in those cases, you have to make it right with the client. They also focus on your own procedure for testing. So they want you to be testing your fee billing. And if you have a design flaw in your sampling procedures, they will press you on that. One of the things we've also seen is with respect to the annual compliance review under 20647. Everybody does one, but they're varying in depth, shall we say. And so staff is really looking for a thoughtful reflection on the compliance program and not just check the box rubber stamp type approach to that review. And that's an area actually where if you have an outside consultant or outside counsel, they can be very helpful to you, and you should feel free to deploy them to help you get through that. And then I guess one of the other common areas we see is questions about how you calculate your regulatory assets under management. I mean, for discretionary assets, that's very easy. They're all in. It's the non-discretionary assets where the definition is a little complex and nuanced, and it's easy to make a mistake, but that is an area where they will press you, and they're going to want to make sure that the number you're quoting to the world is the right number.
Great insights. Tracy, how about yourself?
Well, I can't echo the points enough about the risk alerts. The exam staff really focus on responses and responsiveness to those risk alerts. Common deficiencies are almost always, at least in my experience, failures to respond to something that was highlighted as an issue in a risk alert. I think one of the most common deficiencies goes back to your point, Carlo, about doing what you say and saying what you do. They're really looking hard at your written policies and procedures. So if your procedure or policy says that the CCO signs off on XYZ, or exceptions to the policy must be escalated to XYZ committee, they're looking for you to substantiate that that actually happened. And if it doesn't, then you'll get a deficiency on your policies. So aspirational policies and procedures are not necessarily a good thing, I would say. And they also want to make sure, again, that the CCO's responsibilities as it relates to the compliance program are sensible and practical and have been operationalized. So again, if there are things that the CCO has delegated, they want to see that in your policy and procedures. And then I think private funds, they're just so focused on the disclosures in the PPM versus what you say in your side letters. They seem to be focused on the duty of care, and lots of the deficiencies that you see are things, and we've seen this in the private fund risk alert and the recent private fund advisor proposals, that there are things that they feel are potentially on the borderline of the duty of care, and so they press hard on a lot of those things.
Thanks, Tracy. You know, just going back to ESG before we move on to the next topic, we were talking yesterday in our prep session, what might we expect on the enforcement side around ESG this year? So you've got exams that have been occurring for the past 2 years, really since it first appeared in the exam priorities, and identifying deficiencies each of those years. You saw those in the ESG risk alert, and you've got 20 enforcement lawyers in a dedicated unit in enforcement with that initial set of deficiencies to at least start mining and look through for potential cases. So we wouldn't be surprised if we started to see some enforcement action coming forward on the ESG front this year. Okay, the third area is recent focus areas. And here, from an ACA industry-wide perspective, we've observed recent focus on marketing, as Anil mentioned, performance calculation and presentation, inconsistent content across advertising materials. We've seen focus around cherry picking, and we've seen focus on how credit lines are factored into performance calculation, disclosure, and presentation. A second recent focus area is digital assets. And here we've seen a focus on portfolio management, books and records. Custody has been probably one of the trickiest areas, so a lot of focus around custody with digital assets. And then disclosure, valuation, there's been a lot of volatility, obviously, and on the whole registration issue. Do they need to be registered or not? And the SEC has been pretty clear to encourage in favor of registration. A third area is alternative data. And here we've seen a lot of recent focus on the diligence process, how compliance and legal are involved in looking at potential alternative data vendors. If they decide to clear a vendor and bring them in, and now they become a data provider, looking at how that data is being distributed and incorporated into the investment decision-making process, and what are the controls and policies and procedures around that. And then a lot of focus on kind of the cadence and approach to ongoing monitoring around alternative data. And then the fourth area that we would highlight is BCP and cybersecurity as a recent focus area. No surprise. Obviously, there was a lot of focus during the COVID environment, but really the scrutiny, and I think, Tracy, you mentioned this in one of our prep sessions, is around, like, let's see the policies and procedures demonstrating that you've upgraded your programs, updated your programs based on what you've learned during COVID, and looking for red lines and really getting a sense that that's in place and operating. Another real big focus area on BCP and cyber is around vendor due diligence and the process that you're following for that. For private market funds, there's been a lot of focus recently on portfolio company oversight in the cyber and BCP area. And then, as we saw in the recent rule proposal, a lot of focus around incident reporting, escalation, remediation, and disclosure around those issues. Let me start, Anil, with you and see what are some of the key areas that you're seeing in terms of recent focus.
Well, usually by this time of year, we have the advantage of having the exam priorities list, which we don't have yet, as far as I know. But that will give you a nice preview of what the focus areas are going to be for the coming year. Independent of that, I mean, many of the issues that I raised when I was talking about common deficiencies are also areas that we see in most of our routine, if not all of our routine exams of wealth management firms: advertising, custody, fee billing. And in addition to that, the staff, more or less in every exam, questions the share class selection that our firms have used when picking mutual funds for clients. So that's an area where we've encouraged them really for years, since this became a huge enforcement topic, to be periodically reviewing client share classes to make sure that they're not eligible for anything that's less expensive. The staff also, if you are recommending affiliated or proprietary products, they're going to look very hard at that. It's a natural and obvious conflict, so I understand why they're skeptical. And you know, for our firms, a few of them have proprietary funds that they recommend to their clients, and so those firms are on notice that they should be prepared to answer some tough questions from the staff during exams. In addition to that, I think we've started to see, and I guess we can thank the DOL for this, curiosity about rollovers, specifically rollovers from ERISA plans into IRAs at your firms. I'm guilty of thinking of that only as a DOL issue ever since they made it an issue in 2016, but it really is also a best interest issue under the Advisors Act and the Advisors Act interpretation that came out in 2019. So I think it's useful to think about rollovers from both a DOL and an SEC perspective, but if you get it right for the DOL, you're probably also getting it right for the SEC, but at the same time, you should be prepared to answer questions about your rollover practices in an SEC exam. And then another area that we see intense interest from the staff, although hopefully we don't have this problem, is freelancing on Form CRS language. So that document is very different from ADV Part 2. You have a lot of flexibility in what you say in your brochure and how you say it. You don't on CRS. You just have to follow the instructions. And you don't want to be guilty of being too smart about CRS. Like you don't want to try to add nuance to it. You should really just follow the instructions, especially with respect to the question about disciplinary events. I mean, they want to see yes or no. And the maximum amount of discretion you have there is if your firm has been hit with a disciplinary event, but your financial professionals have not, or vice versa, you're allowed to say yes for one and no for the other, and that's about it. So, you know, my thoughts on CRS is just keep it simple, do what they tell you to do, and don't let that be the focus of an exam.
Good advice. Tracy, how about yourself? What are you seeing?
Well, actually, picking up, Anil, on your point on Form CRS, as important as CRS is for firms with retail clients, the SEC and even FINRA, for that matter, are very focused on firms who have determined that they don't have to file and distribute a Form CRS. And so it is not uncommon for them to question your judgment, make sure that you have, obtained a proper advice, and that if you have determined that you don't have an obligation to deliver the Form CRS, that you can articulate that very clearly and in a supported fashion. So that has been an area of focus that we've seen across our institutional manager base. I think for us thematically, across every region, there seems to be an objective to get to advisors that they deem to have never been examined, and that means if it has been 10 years or more. And so they are ticking through their lists. Each region has an objective to clean those out. So we've seen a number of exams that have focused on advisors that haven't seen the SEC in more than 10 years. Although I will say on the positive side, contrary to the person who had the 150 item request letter, we have seen shorter exam requests, 25 or 30 items that cover sort of the basic areas that you would expect, and particularly with advisors that are registered with the SEC who have principal places of business outside the U.S., it seems that they will go through that checklist, and depending upon how successful and how concise the responses are and how timely they are, the exam period is relatively efficient, and if they're satisfied with what they've seen, the exam hasn't gone on for much longer than 3 months in those instances. If you are someone who's on a cycle, those exams can actually go long, like 9 months or so.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. And John, how about you?
Yeah, I think I'll highlight a few areas, both on the institutional and then on the retail, and then maybe give a insight into maybe something that's coming that we have seen. On the first one I'd highlight would be climate risk. The staff's very interested in climate risk, and this is separate but related to ESG. I've been informed that there are a number of firms out there that have undergone climate risk exams, both at the end of last year and into this year. And the staff is trying to really understand how the organization digests climate risk, whether it be location risk for climate, whether it move into their investments, and they'll stay away from that from ESG, but it's really a high level, and the staff, as I've experienced and heard from others, really are just looking for a high level. They're getting to be educated on climate risk. They're not coming at it from an expert standpoint, but they really want to learn from you and understand how each firm is doing this, and get just a general view. So whether this is a sweep or not, it's out there. And certainly on the ESG, we would expect that ESG exams would be coming soon for registrants. So that's one that's out there, and firms can get ready for those in a variety of different ways. So that's one on the forefront. Another recent focus area, as I'd mentioned earlier, is the NFA. And I don't know how many firms deal with the NFA, but they undertook an exam last year that was really more of an audit type of exam. And maybe surprisingly or not, they really focused also on cybersecurity, which was an interesting angle that they took. And it's a interesting exam module that they go through, but I've spoken with peers in the industry, and it generally takes about 5-6 months to get through that module, and it's a process, we'll put it that way. Would agree with Neil on the rollovers. I'm hearing from peers in the industry as well on the focus on rollover, so I'll leave it at that, but just want to echo that. And maybe to just voice something that we would expect to be upcoming would be something coming from the JP Morgan case on off-channel comms, hearing from peers across the industry that they're getting ready for an exam or scrutiny of some sort, however that may look in a variety of different ways. And so I'd encourage each of you to chat your friends up here, see what they're doing on that, and maybe even chat with Carlo and see what other registrants are doing out there. But that's certainly one that I suspect is going to be coming soon.
It's a good one to call out.
Yeah, actually, if I could just jump in on that. So I understand a couple of other large banks are now under investigation, at least if the articles I read are accurate over the same issue. The interesting thing to me about the case that John mentioned is that having looked through it, it's not really new. I mean, the amount is eye-popping, but the points of law that are being vindicated in that enforcement action are old. And in fact, I think in the press release, the chair may have referenced that those rules have been in place for decades. But when I was in enforcement quite a long time ago now, I worked on an investigation of a broker-dealer for a number of interesting potential violations, and we had trouble getting documents out of them. And it got extreme, and the commission took some intermediate actions that were at the time unprecedented in order to facilitate our investigation. And we ended up bringing a documents-only case, much like the J.P. Morgan case, for a lot less money, although it was considered, I think, a lot of money at the time, but I guess inflation has taken hold. So I think we brought a case for about $10 million against this broker-dealer simply for not turning over documents to the staff promptly. It really is a question of protecting the ability of the commission to ensure market integrity and to ensure the integrity of their investigation. So it is not a books and records issue. It's really a fundamental investigative issue, and it should be taken very seriously.
And Neil, I actually think it's one of the important things about that case, too, is people should not, we talked about this in our prep session, don't get overly comforted by the fact that J.P. Morgan and others in these cases have registered broker-dealers. The fact that the broker-dealer record retention rule is the business as such is certainly helpful, but advisors should be mindful that any means of communication that your people are using, the SEC takes a broad view of what's a books and records requirement. And so if you do have people using social media, even in violation of your policies, you need to get a handle on that and make sure that you've got the records retention under control.
Great. Really, really valuable additional insights on that point. All right, we've got just over 12 minutes left, and we've got our last topic, which is what to expect when it's your turn for an examination. So from an ACA industry-wide perspective, we would suggest the following expectations would be good for you to have. One is to expect to have the SEC go deeper than in the past, and conduct an increasing amount of independent verifications. Two, expect to receive significantly longer document request lists. As the gentleman mentioned to us before the session, that particular document request list was out of Denver. But also expect to have to produce that data in 10 to 14 days, so not a lot of time for production. Third, expect to have marketing materials, websites, and social media be a particular area of focus and reviewed very carefully by the SEC. Fourth, expect particular emphasis on performance calculation, presentation, and advertising, particularly projected and back-tested performance numbers and backup for that. Fifth, expect increased focus on cybersecurity and data security matters. No surprise there. Sixth, expect increased focus on the topic we were just talking about, employee business communications via unauthorized channels. And I think that the additional perspective that Anil and John and Tracy offered is really valuable and important to consider. Seventh, for private fund firms, Expect increased focus on the topics that you saw in the June 2020 and now the January 2022 risk alerts, as well as expect increased focus on the proposed rule topic areas. Eighth, expect increased focus on just technical compliance areas. And Anil mentioned some of these, right? Custody rule compliance, personal trading rule compliance. We're seeing, the fundamentals and the basics continue to be a focus area. And then finally, expect increased scrutiny and focus on your firm if you're engaged with SPACs or digital assets. Let me turn it over to the panel, and maybe Tracy, starting with you. What would you advise folks to expect?
Well, one thing that I would advise you not to expect is the SEC is no longer concerned about the amount of data. It used to be the case that they would say, give us all your marketing materials for the last 2 years, and you could say, well, that's 500,000 pieces of material. You don't really want that, right? The answer is yes, they do. If they want emails, if you've got terabytes, it's okay, they'll take it. And they want it in the form that they want it. So there can be some delivery challenges associated with that. And I think in an exam setting, delivery challenges can be your worst nightmare. They really are expecting you to produce documents. To your earlier point, they have been flexible. They're happy to do rolling production, but if you're having trouble producing documents, then that will pretty much raise a red flag. The other thing I would say, in the last 2 years, the exams are virtual. Each examiner is different. Some of them will be on video. Some of them will say, we're not going to be on video. But in either case, even if they present as though it's a less formal approach, it is a formal approach. They do expect you to have senior management present. They may say, if you'd like to do a presentation, we're happy to entertain that. They want a presentation. And it's in your best interest, frankly, to lead with that, because it often changes the complexion of the exam. They understand what your business is, and they see that you're happy to collaborate and work with them. And I would say on document production, I can't stress accuracy enough. The biggest challenge we have seen in some exams are in particular around when you change technology. So if you've switched your code of ethics compliance system or moved your trading or OMS, they want to make sure that you're being able to produce accurate records across the entire examination period. And so it's helpful when you run your trade blotter, or if you're producing other records, to do a reconciliation just to make sure that they're getting the data that they're expecting.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I think you also just make a really good point about the regulators now have such advanced technology. So whether it's trade analytics or natural language processing to look at written submissions, or machine learning to really turbocharge their ability to do analysis, they can ingest a tremendous amount of information and have the technology focus right in on the areas of deficiency. And to that end, I think you all remember when Pete Driscoll gave a speech on CCO empowerment and resources. He really called out that, we're going to look to see the CCOs empowered. We're also going to look to see that they've got adequate resources, and part of that means that you're using technology consistent with kind of what industry practice is, right? So just like the regulators are using technology a whole lot more, so are firms, and that's a moving bar.
Actually, it's interesting, on the CCO empowerment, there's also a focus on the CCO's knowledge of the business. And for those of you who attended the private fund, private advisor discussion panel, one of the things that the SEC staff are focused on was the fact that they are actually looking for the CCO to be able to present on all aspects of the business, not just the compliance program. And we have seen that where the exam staff has wanted to hear from the portfolio managers in an interview setting, but then we'll direct questions at the CCO as well around how they think about what the business is doing.
Great point. John, what suggestions would you have?
Yeah, I have 4 quick ones, and this maybe talks to maybe the newer folks to compliance, but maybe a good reminder for all of us. First is to have a plan. Have a plan about where you want to store your documents, how you want to process them, and who you're going to go to in the business. The next one would be prep the business. And prep the business means maybe for smaller firms talking to Dawn, who owns IT, but she also owns a little bit of something else, but letting her know that something's coming down the line and that it could be, she may be called on to produce some material. Likewise, whoever's the investment management side or whatnot. The third would be ready to pivot, because always in an exam there's, or oftentimes there are some unique questions that come your way. And so again, it's maybe prepping your business people to understand that the staff might be going down a different route here, and just preparing that. And fourth really is to engage the staff right from the beginning. So set expectations. If you need a little bit of time to have a rolling production, just establish that really good relationship with them at first, and it'll go both ways. It has been my experience. So I'd leave you with those 4.
Yeah, great guidance. Anil, how about yourself?
I guess I'd just focus on 2 things. I mean, the staff seems to be clicking along on all cylinders. They really haven't skipped a beat during the COVID environment. So I think you should expect a searching and thorough inquiry. I also think the days of 25 or 30 item request lists may be numbered or over. As I mentioned earlier, I've seen a couple that have crossed 100. I'd never, until today, heard of one that crossed 150, but that is a remarkable request, and it requires a tremendous investment of time, energy, and money to respond just to that initial request. I mean, I have no idea what the number is going to grow to during that exam. I mean, it could easily eclipse 200. I don't want to scare the guy who told us. But, it's just, they will have some follow-up requests. I guess the other thing to do in terms of preparing, I mean, certainly as John was saying, like having your files in order so that you can easily produce documents to the staff helps. From a substantive perspective, those risk alerts are really valuable. The exam priorities are really valuable. I wouldn't just look at the last year's risk alerts and exam priorities. I'd look back a couple of years. I'd try to see which ones are repeat entries on those lists. And the other thing I'd do is I would just keep track of enforcement cases. I mean, you can easily get on the SEC's press release list, and every time you see an enforcement case that strikes your interest, take a look at the press release. It doesn't take that much time, but you might learn something that could help you down the road in an exam.
Great. Well, we are at time here. We have a couple minutes. No questions have come up on my desk, but we probably have time to take one question if any brave soul wants to rise and ask. Oh, sorry. The code word. Where would I find the code word? Is there? I don't see it on the screen. Chester, the first code?
Chapter 1.
Chapter. The code word, first one is chapter?
Elegant.
Elegant. Chapter and elegant. Oh, these. That would be this piece of paper right here. Chapter and elegant. All right, well, thank you very much to the panel. Great job. And thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.